I'd now like to introduce to you my colleague Josh Lambier. He's the Director of the Public Humanities at Western and one of the organizers of Words, and he is going to be the host and interviewer of tonight's panel. Josh.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see everybody here. It's absolutely fantastic. We started planning this festival over a year ago, right after the last festival, and you're always thinking what's going to appeal, what's going to make people come, what's going to make people excited about literature, about words in the City of London, and today it's a wonderful opportunity to see how the city is embracing words, and we're absolutely thrilled to see everybody here. And I'm speaking on behalf of the committee of individuals that organized the festival. And I'm told that John Payton is here now, and thank you very much. Where is John? Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. One of the people that made the festival possible. We have an exciting lineup of guests this weekend, and one of the things that we wanted to do was give you guys an opportunity to see some of the authors that will be featured throughout the weekend of events. So I'm going to ask 4 of our authors to make their way to the stage while I make some introductory remarks, because I know they're spread around the room. The first individual I'd like to introduce is Terry Fallis, Emil Sher, Allan Stratton, and Andy McGuire. So make your way on up to the One thing I do want to mention as well, and it's something to keep in mind, is that we have something that we're doing this year called an instant zine, or the Words Fest zine. And there is a tab on the website. If you go onto the wordsfest.ca website, on the top right-hand corner of that website, there's the possibility of submitting something to be instantly published. So how about that, right? You come to the festival, you submit something under 250 words, and you can be published. We have a team of editors who are putting together the contributions over the space of the weekend, and they're appropriately named the Insomniac Press Crew, because only an Insomniac could think of this idea. And they will be producing that magazine, and there's going to be a launch party at 3:30 p.m. on the final day on Sunday. So contribute, and you can be part of a lasting memory of this festival, and it's something that we're going to carry forward. So that's available to everybody. One of our driving motivations to begin a literary and creative arts festival in London arose from the desire to recognize London's sometimes hidden status as a crucible for fostering outstanding writers and thinkers. Southwestern Ontario, or SOWESTO, to invoke the name that painter Greg Curneau gave to the region, has a long history of nurturing its fair share of Canada's brightest writers. The legacy is alive and well in our own community at Western, where I'm from, bolstered very recently by the success of one of our celebrated alumni and former writers-in-residence, Alice Munro, who, as you know, just won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for literature. Her career has galvanized the university's commitment to support the creation of a new chair in creativity, an endowed chair in creativity. One of Fanshaw's graduates happens to be Paul Haggis, who has gone on to write Oscar-winning films like Crash and $1 Million Baby. In London, too, there is a lively literary scene of activity with regular, well-attended meetings by the London Poetry Slam, Poetry London, and Open Mic Poetry Night, as well as the London Writers Society, to name only a few. And you're going to meet these groups throughout the weekend. On Saturday night, if you have your own poetry, come out to Marion Bad Restaurant and read your own poetry. These groups are unbeknownst to many, too many, in fact. We have a vibrant community of writers that in this community should be celebrated, and we should bring more visibility to the creatives who make the artistic life in London what it is. We also need to create a forum to highlight the creativity of a new generation of aspiring writers. Despite an old and unfortunately resilient view of our region as quiet or a homely periphery to the dynamic centers of the province, SOWESTO, as Margaret Atwood pointed out, is also an area of considerable psychic murkiness and oddity. unhomely qualities that pervade the Gothic atmospherics of Munro's short stories. So let's look into some of the aspects of this, as well as some of the backgrounds of our authors. I'm going to introduce each of our authors, and then I'm going to try and draw some connections, and you guys can jump in. If the question's not directly addressed to you, feel free to jump in, and at the end, I'm going to try and give everybody here an opportunity to chat with them as well. So our first speaker is Allan Stratton, is an award-winning, and maybe you could raise your hand, Allan, is an award-winning, internationally published playwright and novelist, and happens to be from London, Ontario. He went to Oak Ridge Secondary School here in London, and actually, he was just telling me, had the opportunity to work with James Rainey and publish your first work in Alphabet.
That's right. I was in grade 9, and you know, when you're a kid, you just think that life is the way it should be, and there's nothing special about it. And I realize now how incredibly fortunate I was to work with Jamie when I was a 14-year-old. He was doing Listen to the Wind, the very first production, and I was cast in a little tiny part, and from there went on to be in his listener's workshop at Alpha Center, which was on Talbot Street, one of those wonderful arts old homes that are now gone. And Jamie gave me the opportunity to have one of my first plays published in his Alphabet magazine. I was in grade 12, and by luck there was a CBC producer from Vancouver who happened to read that and said, well, would you like to do a radio adaptation of your work? And I said, well, sure. I was, 18, and that's when I had my first play on CBC. And that's because of James Rainey, who is, I think, you were talking about Alice Munro, but I think James Rainey is Canada's finest playwright. His Donnelly's trilogy, I don't think has ever been beaten.
Wonderful, and it's wonderful to hear these stories about London, Ontario. Your work is internationally known. I'm thinking of Chanda's Secrets was chosen for the Prince Honor Book, amongst many other awards it has won, and appeared on the big screen as Life Above All. You have also a recent book coming out, or is out, The Dogs, and it's a chilling psychological thriller for young adult readers. Our second panelist, Terry Fallis, is an award-winning author of 4 national bestsellers, The Best Laid Plans, The High Road, Up and Down, No Relation, and his 5th novel, which will no doubt be added to that list of award-winning novels, Poles Apart, has just made it to the world in October of this year. His debut novel, The Best Laid Plans, won the 2008 Stephen Leacock Medal for Humor and was crowned the 2011 winner of the Canada Reads. In January of 2014, CBC aired a 6-part television miniseries based on The Best Laid Plans. No Relation also won the 2015 Leacock Medal. So welcome, Terry, to our panel.
Thank you.
Emil Sher wears many hats as a writer, and he writes, as he says, for the young and once were young. He wrote the stage adaptation of Hannah's Suitcase, the Holocaust children's book by Karen Levine. Other plays for young audiences include Blue Nose and Beneath the Banyan Tree. Emil founded Breadbox Theatre in 2005 to introduce early grade school children to the joys of live theater with a story that unfolds in a breadbox filled with kitchen utensil puppets. In recent years, he has started to write children's fiction, including his debut young adult novel, Young Man with Camera, which was recently shortlisted for the Governor General's Award for Children's Literature. Other works include his stage plays, such as Morning Dove and his adaptation of Ian Brown's The Boy in the Moon. Welcome very much, Emil.
Thank you. And if I could just take a moment, because I just want to thank from the bottom of my heart the warm welcome I've been given in London, but to Josh Lambier for driving this festival and doing all that he's done to have brought us to this point. Thank you.
And finally, last but not least, Andy McGuire is a poet and musician from Grand Bend, Ontario, and currently resides in Toronto. He is pursuing an MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph. Andy's poems have appeared in Riddle Fence, Hazlitt, and The Walrus. And he has also published his first book of poetry with Coach House Books, Country Club, out this year. A lyrical wilderness of power, wealth, leisure, and desire, the poems of Country Club freewheel across state lines with panache and flagrant feeling. In this bold debut from McGuire, all passions, even unpleasant ones, stare down the barrel of a world in which freedom is the 51st state and love is the 11th province. Welcome, Andy. Okay, I'm going to start with a question that I think links many of our authors on the panel, and one of the reasons why is it's an old adage of writing. And the old adage is that you write what you know. And I'm thinking here of Terry, your novels really bring pieces of you, your life, your personality to the page. From Best Laid Plans, to High Road, to Up and Down, and your recent book, Poles Apart. Can you talk about how your life informs your work?
Sure, I just should point out that the S&M scene in the Best Laid Plans, I know nothing about that at all. But isn't that what the internet is for? I actually don't have enough time in my life to write anything other than what I know. I also find it easier to write with authority and conviction and authenticity if I'm writing about something that I've experienced before, that I'm passionate about, that I care about, that I'm trying to make a point about, even if I may be trying to make people laugh at the same time. That's my stealthy way of getting into some issues. So I just find it easier to do that. And if I were to choose to write about something I knew nothing about and then proceeded to spend 2 years doing back-breaking research on it, I still don't know that I could write about that with as much authority and conviction as I can write about things that I've experienced in my own life. So in a way, it's a time-saving and effort-saving measure on my part, and there's still enough pieces of my life that I haven't yet explored in print that I can. There's a few more novels I think I've got left to do. But having said that, the novels aren't autobiographical, and I think there's an important distinction there. Having worked in the back rooms of politics, I can write about that with considerable knowledge. It isn't what happened to me necessarily.
That's wonderful, and we're going to come back to that point as well of your life in politics. I want to carry this over to Allan. Your work, The Dogs, carries us into some darker territory with the psychological thriller about a boy and his mother who are on the run from an abusive father. I was surprised to learn as I was looking into your work that Cameron, the boy, is the closest character you've written to yourself. It's a sensitive topic to be handled with care indeed, but I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about Cameron and his relationship to you.
Yeah, well, I talk to myself, as does Cameron. I am very, very glad now that there's Bluetooth, because people will think that I'm on the phone to somebody. My lips move, it's out loud, etc. When I was a baby, I was 1. My mom fled from my dad, and we ended up at this farmhouse in Kincardine, where my grandparents were living. And that's when I started to write, because I had a lot of time. And before I could really spell, I was sounding things out and trying to make letters on paper to make sense of experience and to figure out how life worked. That's where I think the idea of stories came from. One of the things that I was always asking myself was, who am I and who are the people around me? I once actually called the hospital in Stratford to see if I'd actually been born to my parents. I was about 13 at the time. At any rate, I do remember thinking as a kid, who is my dad? Is my dad the guy that my mom loved enough to marry? Or is he the man that she's so frightened of that we lock the place up tight whenever he's around? Or is he the guy that I know who's been, if I'm in a tug of war, rope in the over the threshold? Or is he the person that my half-brother and my half-sister know, or my stepmom knows? So who is, and then I'm wondering, who am I? Because I have a different presentation now to you than I do when I'm presenting, say, to relatives or to friends or thinking alone to myself. So who are we? We're a mix of all these kind of things, and that's, I guess, where the connection between myself and Cameron comes from. Cameron ends up imagining that he's talking to the ghost of a boy, Jackie, whom he believes was murdered with his mom on this farm 50 years before, where he and his mother have ended up. And the question is he crazy? Has he been driven mad and is projecting his own fear of his father? Or was there, in fact, a cold case that he's uncovering? That's at the heart of it. And then the other question for Cameron is his dad really a violent psychopath, or is his mother a paranoid, and is his dad actually fine? So it's who are we? And those are all the kinds of things that the Dogs explores.
Thank you very much. And we're going to come back to some of those themes as well. I want to turn to Andy on this topic as well of life and writing. And you have this wonderful gift of writing lists. I'm a Facebook friend of Andy's, and sometimes he'll do lists. And they're just about the best thing that I see on Facebook. They sometimes interweave your poetry with your personal life in a fascinating way. And I was wondering if I could impose on you and to put you on the spot to hear one of your top 10 lists.
Yes, absolutely. I have to pull one up really quickly here. I'll just say, while I'm pulling it up, that I think a big part of writing is not writing, and a big part of having a life in writing is not writing, and so. I'm always trying to find ways of using every part of the day. You as a poet, you're kind of always working. Moving through the world and just pillaging language from wherever you can, and these top 10 lists just kind of began as a fun thing that I would see chimney coming out of a smoke, and I would see smoke coming out of a smoke coming out of a chimney, and say, oh well, top 10 signs of life. This is kind of putting me on the spot here. I need to. Can we come back to?
Certainly can come back.
Can we come back to the list?
Yes, I thought you were good on you were getting that. We will come back. We'll get to the top 10 list.
Okay.
I'm going to turn over to Emil. I did put you on the spot for that one for sure. I'm going to ask Emil how, in some ways, one of the things that you've done so well is to talk about what Terry had described as the fact that autobiography does blur, and that you have to enter into your characters in ways that sometimes don't reflect necessarily one's life. And you have this wonderful gift of writing from the voice of a younger person, of younger people. And I'm thinking of the first case of your newly released book, Young Man with Camera, with the main character T. How did you go about immersing yourself into the voice of a 13-year-old teenage character T, especially while he's facing such a difficult question such as bullying?
I guess the joy, the challenges of writing are also its rewards. And I guess it's the idea of also the challenge of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. In terms of autobiography, I wasn't bullied. I've actually been asked, this kid is really bullied. He was born, owing to a childhood accident, he has these facial scars, about 5 or 6 years old. And it doesn't take long, kids being kids, he's just pounced upon for these scores. He's just completely marginalized and mortified because of what he has to go through. And people come to me and said, "Oh, was that you?" And I thought it wasn't me. I mean, I've had the good graces of not being bullied. And I think maybe it's because of that I'm definitely drawn to the margins, and I'm drawn to the darkness, because I think it's only when we immerse ourselves in the dark that we can appreciate the light. And I think light has all the more meaning when we immerse ourselves in the dark. If you picture, a match takes very different significance when it's a dark room. And so in terms of the 13-year-old boy, that was, yes, I was once 13 a long time ago, but I think you were talking about London authors, I think of Emma Donoghue with Room. It's the same idea that is to immerse yourself. In a way, that's why I think all writing is not only is an act of faith, it's an act of hope. By literally, when you're writing, that in and of itself is an act of hope, because you are, by virtue, you're putting yourself either in someone else's shoes, even if you're putting yourself in your own shoes, it's from in that moment. There's nothing that's really truly autobiographical. Creation by its very notion is, as I say, an act of hope. So in terms of getting this young boy's voice, it's told from a first person's perspective of a 13-year-old boy, trial and error. I mean, that's why we work with editors. And God bless editors, because I think they will pull you back. I think there's a tendency to go too far, to overwrite. There are times when I knew, but after a while, when you get to know it's a voice, it's a bit frightening, because these characters become very real. And you have these conversations and you hear them, and there were times when I would self-edit, when I would say, T would never say that. It didn't sound authentic. And I think at the end of the day, that's the word, I mean, it sounds so lofty, but this notion, and Linden spoke before about the search for the truth, but I think this notion of authenticity. And you know it in your bones, you know it as a reader, and I think you know it as a writer. And getting towards that means tripping a lot and getting it wrong. And I think there's great value. This book, I think it clocks in at about 42, 43,000 words, but I wrote close to 70,000. So we're talking at least 25,000 words, which I would have spent months on. Were ditched, gone. Then that's when we curse the editors. But I can tell you, it was necessary, and it was not for naught. It was not wasted. And like anything else, when you're lost, sometimes you have to go down several paths and retrace your steps before you find what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful answer. And maybe I could also pose this question to Allan. And I wanted to direct this question because you have Enchanted Secrets, the worldview of a teenage girl who's 16 years old in the first book, in which we confront the magnitude of the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa, and then the question of child soldiers in the follow-up novel. How do you tie together issues with such gravity into the story of a teenage girl? How do you approach that question?
Well, I think that under the skin we're all the same. I think we've been better than our best selves and worse than our worst selves. I started as an actor, so I always ask for every character in every scene, what do I want? Because everybody wants something. And everybody has a goal, and everybody uses tactics to get what they want, and which actors might also call objectives. And then there's also an obstacle. And if I'm the obstacle, so if I'm doing a one-person improv, I want something, I do blah, blah. And then so I'm the person who's been acted upon. Okay, I'm in this other situation. How would I respond? So that's why I think that ultimately, it doesn't matter your age or your gender or your ethnicity, your religion, your orientation. Ultimately, we share life experiences, and that's part of, I think, the magic of writing and part of the magic of reading. It's why we're able to communicate with the dead, people who have lived centuries ago in other continents, through their words, through these squiggles of ink on paper that are just these abstract symbols. And that's really, I think, how one does it. One connects one's experience about what it is to be human, and one tries to imagine oneself into the shoes of someone else. And then one hopes that one does that successfully enough that others are engaged by that, and that when one shows it to them, they can be engaged. I know I'm taking a bit of time here, but I think the most moving thing that has happened to me as a reader was to get an email from a teacher in Sub-Sahara where my book is studied and a fair bit. And one of the things she said to me, she was one of the first ones who was doing it, was that there were kids in the village where she taught whose parents had passed away from HIV/AIDS, and they were too ashamed to talk about how their own parents had died, and that was eating them up. And she said there was this one boy who had seen the book in her library and asked if she could read it, and she said yes, and he came back a few days later and he said, "Miss, I was lying on my bed reading the book, and the sun was shining in through my window, and I realized I was crying. Ma'am, I haven't cried for 2 years." And he started talking about how Chanda had dealt with her mother's passing and reading that story to his friends. And the book is often used there as a kind of grief therapy. I mean, here it's studied, but there it's used sort of as grief therapy. And that I found very, it made me really pleased and honored that it was very humbling to know that I've been able to touch those kids in that way. So I guess you just try and be as honest as you possibly can and hope that your understanding of life touches the understanding of others.
Brilliant. Beautiful answer. Thank you so much. Part of Terry's background also includes his engineering background. And the way that Terry brings his engineering background into his writing is absolutely fascinating. I've often heard writers describe their process as being like an architect or an engineer, but in your case, it's not a metaphor, it's literally you're an engineer. Can you describe how your engineering background comes into the architecture of your work?
Well, my engineering background is certainly inextricably linked to almost everything that I do in my life. I view the world through an engineering lens, even though I've never practiced a day of professional engineering in my life. I fled engineering as soon as I got my degree and went into politics, but I still think like one. And engineers don't build bridges without blueprints. I don't write a novel without a blueprint. And if I'm writing the manuscript, it means I have been thinking and outlining and plotting and mapping for the preceding 8 months or so. I don't write the first word in the manuscript until I know almost everything there is to know about the novel. So what it allows me to do when I have a 60-page outline for my novel, 2 or 3 pages of bullet points for each chapter, and I know how long each chapter is, I know the arc, not just of the story, but the arc of each individual chapter. At that stage, it allows me to apply all of my questionable cerebral powers on crafting sentences only. No part of my brain is thinking about, where is my character going to go after I finish this paragraph? Because I think that would compromise my ability to write as well as I want to write. So it's actually it's a defense mechanism to allow me to write at my best, because I'm really just worried about sentences at that point in the process. So. That's it in a nutshell.
And yet one of your characters has writer's block, Ernest Hemingway, which is really fascinating that you, just having these wonderful outlines, which facilitates that writing process, had the challenge of writing for this scenario. How did you write that?
Well, I don't really know what it's like to have writer's block in the sense that you probably think of writer's block, where you're staring at the page, as my character was in that novel, with chapter 12 or 9 at the top, and the cursor just blinking at you, and you're completely blocked. You cannot write a single word. Because of how I approach writing, or the process I use, I've never had that experience. I think the equivalent of that for me would be story block, where 3 months earlier, I'm struggling to figure out how I'm going to get from plot point B to plot point C, and that sometimes takes some time. But once you have the outline staring at you in the face, anyone in the room who was able to construct reasonable sentences could write a version of the novel, because it's right there. So
Just anyone.
I can never use the excuse I have writer's block, because there are my 3 pages of bullet points for chapter 6. Surely I can make something of it.
Andy, your background as a musician, I've heard you read before, and there's something very, the cadence and the melody of the way that you read, and the performance aspect of the way that you read. How does being a musician inform your writing of poetry and being a poet as that category? Use those categories.
I mean, they've been very separate for me, at least in the practice. I mean, being a musician, I guess, has given me a certain sense of rhythm and cadence, and my poems are very performative in a way, but melody is a whole other beast, you know, like that's the main difference between them. Yeah, I guess, I mean, the value in being a musician and writing poems, and I was kind of more of a musician first, I guess the value is in that sense of rhythm and tone. Tone is the closest you can get, I think, to melody in poetry. Excuse me. But the performative element of my work is probably the biggest overlapping element, I think, between my musical work and my poetry. Even though, I mean, the songs are really obviously sweet, and you know, all of them are just horribly sad, which, I mean, you know, what's music for, right? if not that, I think the poems are less obviously sweet.
That's wonderful. I want to come back to something that Emil had said about embracing that darkness, and some of your work really does delve into challenging issues. And I'm thinking here of your play, Mourning Dove, and mourning spelled in the process of mourning rather than the time of day, though you can address this as well. And there's a line that I hear from Leonard Cohen's song Anthem that was important to you, and the line is this: there is a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. Just a quick gloss. Morning Dove is a play inspired by the Latimer affair, in which Saskatchewan farmer Robert Latimer was convicted of second-degree murder for the mercy killing of his severely disabled daughter, Tracy, who had cerebral palsy. I wanted to ask a question about the kind of, I want to say, chiaroscuro atmospherics of these sharp contrasts between dark and light in your work, which appears in the composition and the thematics of this particular play. What drew you to the Latimer case, and how did you confront such a challenging ethical question in your work?
The Latimer, I assume most of you are familiar, I think it was like 1995, and Robert Latimer, and I think one reason why people were, I think it's fair to say, he took, as Josh had mentioned, his daughter's life, 12-year-old Tracy Latimer, she had cerebral palsy, and she was slated, and this is important, to have yet another operation. They had put steel rods in her back, and she was about to have her hip bone sawed off, and they were going to make an artificial bone and put it back into the socket. It was described, it actually began as a radio play for CBC that I did for Morningside, and then I adapted for the stage. And what drew to me was this, drama, of course, is fueled by conflict. And at its essence, here I saw a story, and I'll talk about the dramatization, of a man who basically said, I love my daughter so fiercely, so passionately, I'm going to take her life. So from a dramatic point of view, that is very compelling. But then you have to layer it. And I actually watched footage of Latimer himself. There was CBC footage. He very casually, because he was convinced he did the right thing, I think it was the RCMP, he shows the pickup truck. He said, yep, here's where I put the hose, ran it into the cab, turned on the engine. Very matter of fact. And if you saw him when he was arrested, he looked besieged. What wrong did I do? He saw it as a very private affair. And again, that didn't interest me in terms of appeal. I've been asked, has Latimer seen the play? And I don't think he has. There was a production in Lethbridge, Alberta. I think a cousin of his came to see it. But if I had to project, and it's the wrong thing to do, but if I had to guess, if he saw it, I think he'd hate it. Because in fact, what draws me also, we talk about darkness and lightness, the worst type, not the worst, I reject writing that is black and white. That's didactic. I'm interested in the grays. And there's lots of gray areas, because I was asked at the time, my daughters at the time were, I remember my daughter was 18 months old and had the flu, she was throwing up. It was heartbreaking. And I was asked, could I take my daughter's life? And I'm thinking, I don't know, it's unimaginable, but the big question is, what if you're in that person's shoes? And I was drawn to explore the play. And it's worked both ways. I didn't set out an agenda. It was merely as I say to explore these issues, but I took a dramatic license. For example, in the Latimer story himself, I believe Laura Latimer, I'm not sure, but I think she was pregnant at the time. That changed the dynamic. For the purpose of the play, they have but one child. And they decide as a couple, we will love this daughter fiercely. And in fact, in one line at the end of the play, the wife trying to console him says, when the babe was born, she says, we're going to outlive her, so we have to outlove her. The stakes are much higher when it's the one child. But at the end of the play, you talk about the crack in the light, and it's not a spoiler alert. I mean, he does take the child's life. He does end up going to prison. But the wife says at the very end of the play, she loves you still. And he says, you think? I'll leave it at that.
Incredibly powerful. And these issues of occupying those spaces that sometimes fall away, this happens in Allan, your work with Borderline, a story of a Muslim boy who has to fend or fight for his life and his freedom. Can you talk a bit about this play too, and what drives you to that outsider perspective?
It was the novel, yeah.
The novel, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was thinking
Well, when I was 8 years old, I remember being underneath the picnic table, and it was in the late 1950s. My grandparents on my dad's side were quite conservative, and they were talking about how they favored the death penalty. And I remember that as an 8-year-old, I started to sweat. This cold sweat, because I was absolutely convinced that when I grew up, I was going to be accused of a crime that I didn't do, and that I was going to be found guilty, and that I was going to be hanged. I was very serious. And I have always felt that we don't get what's right, we get what we get. And that sense of outrage at the way Muslims were being treated in the wake of 9/11, and still is what fueled that. I mentioned the thing about the father issue came up between the father and the son and the outsider and all the rest of that. And I know what it's like to be part of a marginalized group. I grew up in London being gay back in the 1950s and 60s, and it was no picnic, let me tell you. And so you know what it's like to have lies told about you and lies told about your community. You know what it's like not to be able to defend yourself because no one's going to believe you. And so that's where I started off with that book. This kid who doesn't even know the truth about his dad and wants to find out the truth about his dad, and that sense of that life is not fair, that has stuck with me to this day.
Incredibly compelling. I'm going to switch our gear over to how tragedy, in some ways, is the opposite side, but so close to comedy. And I'm thinking of, I want to tell you about Terry's first novel, and many of you might know this story, but it's absolutely compelling. Terry's meteoric emergence into Canadian literature with his first book, The Best Laid Plans, was a political satire that tells the story of the electoral success of an unlikely and recalcitrant liberal political candidate, the engineering professor named Angus McClintock, who has been tapped by a former speechwriter to run in a long-held Tory riding. Now, you've described how you wrote this novel on nights and weekends and eventually self-published the novel and turned it into a successful free podcast. Then, with only 10 copies left, the exact number necessary to enter the competition for the Leacock Memorial Medal for Humor, stunningly the same number, you entered and won in 2008. In 2011, The Best Laid Plans would continue its ascent to prominence as the winner of Canada Reads in 2011. I love your description of this experience. You were waiting for the Twilight Zone's Rod Serling to show up, freeze the frame, and describe how the writer's imagination had gone wildly out of control. This is an astonishing story. I wonder, given the recent election, what advice would Angus McClintock have for some of our newly elected MPs?
Advice from Angus. I was thinking about starting a regular newspaper column, Advice from Angus. Actually, there was a hashtag for a while that said, "What would Angus do?" And on Twitter, it was quite gratifying. I think he would be telling Justin and his new cabinet to do that which is right. Do not descend into ultra-partisan negative bickering with the other parties. Be respectful in the House of Commons and keep their eye focused on the promises they have made and implementing them so that when they go back to the polls 4 years from now, they will be greeted warmly by the electorate, but not to be put off by partisanship and the short-term political interest. Keep your eyes focused on the national interest, which is admittedly not always easy to do, but I think that's what Angus would say. And pass the Lagavulin.
Whenever I hear Andy Reid, as I was mentioning, I've had the chance to hear Andy Reid, I think there's a real innate humor in Andy's poetry. And I always think, I think I've told Andy this before, I always think of the great New Yorker humorist Jack Handey, who used to have that segment on Saturday Night Live called Deep Thoughts, because he has this aphoristic way of writing that takes you in one direction only to thwart that expectation and take you in another direction. I'll give you an example from Jack Handey. Before you criticize someone, you should walk a mile in their shoes. That way, when you criticize them, you're a mile away from them and you have their shoes. And last year you interviewed Jeremy Dodds, who also has this very much in his sensibility. In the tight medium of poetry, how conscious are you of that element of humor in your writing? And do you read it out loud? Do you test it? Is it something that maybe you're not aware of How do you craft poetry in that tight genre?
I'm very aware. I mean, humor is kind of like the hammer in my toolbox. I'm very deliberate about the ways that I deploy humor in the poems. Of course, I mean, you can't say to somebody, I have this really funny joke, right? Like, you have to say, I have a joke, and then tell them, and they tell you if you have a funny joke. But humor, that's kind of my sweet spot. Humor that's kind of funny, tragic, sad. Humor with an equal part of vinegar in it. When you make somebody laugh, you open them up. You shake them out of their ingrained perspectives. I was just talking about this with Brian actually earlier tonight, and about humor in poetry. And for me, it's kind of like, slipping the pill of poetry to someone inside a cupcake or something. Like, people aren't always so willing to sit down with a poem because they think it's maybe this really stiff kind of serious thing. But yeah, humor is the people that I'm most interested in reading are very concerned with other people's pleasure, and I am as well.
And it's very fascinating, because I'm thinking too of something that Terry says about political satire, that it's not just enough to find a joke necessarily in something. You have to have a deeper point. You have to have something that you're driving towards. And I was wondering, Terry, if you could comment on that political satire has, of course there's hilarious elements of political life, like candidates that are peeing in mugs and all sorts of crazy things that happen, but there has to be something there. Could you address that element?
Sure. Well, I think a candidate peeing in a mug has nothing to do with satire. Comedy, maybe. Tragedy, perhaps, as well. Especially if it was your mug. But to me, satire needs to take aim at something. Its intent is to undermine something. It's to weaken something. It's to hold somebody's feet to the fire. There is a higher and broader purpose when you're doing satire. So by all means, it ought to make you laugh. But if it doesn't also make you think, which is my litmus test for satire, if it doesn't make you think, I'm not sure it actually has earned the label satire. So it came to me really, this is too long a story to tell, I'll try and tell it very briefly, but I heard a speaker once at a youth conference in Strasbourg, France. It was the annual gathering of the International Federation of Liberal and Radical Youth. You probably know it as IFLRI. And it was a meeting a meeting about racism and xenophobia. And I was the sole Canadian delegate, is when I was serving on Parliament Hill. I was 25 years old at the time. And the speaker was Donald Woods, who was, if you've seen the movie Cry Freedom, about Stephen Biko and apartheid South Africa, Donald Woods was played by Kevin Kline. He was the editor of a South African daily newspaper, and he befriended Biko and became a staunch supporter of the Black consciousness movement, and this is going somewhere. And when Stephen Biko was arrested and beaten to death by the police, he plastered Biko's picture on the front page of the newspaper and said, "A hero for a nation." And he was summarily banned from South Africa, had to escape dressed as a priest with his hair dyed black, and never to return to his homeland. I set that up because at this conference, he spoke to this group of 45 or so young people from all across Europe, and I from Canada, and 2 from the United States. And we were expecting to be outraged, and we'd be pounding the table, but within minutes of him starting, he had us all splitting our sides laughing. And I don't mean these were polite little guffaws. We were tearful. It was so funny as he described how ludicrous and ridiculous the apartheid regime was in South Africa. And I remember holding my stomach and thinking, I'm laughing about apartheid. And in fact, what I realized later that night is that I was laughing at apartheid. And when you laugh at something, an injustice, unchecked power, the status quo, whatever it may be, when you laugh at it, you weaken it. And to me, that's what satire is intended to do, to get you to think about something, maybe to laugh at it, but to undermine it and weaken it. So that's my litmus test.
It's wonderful. To keep with actually a great transition, the question I wanted to ask Allan about South Africa, one of your works was South Africa's 2011 entry for the Oscars. It was Life Above All. What was the experience of seeing your work go to the big screen like?
It was based on Chanda's Secrets. It was really quite amazing. I had a chance and this is one of the things about just always being open to sending stuff out and getting the door slammed in your face. I was working on the novel Chanda's Wars about child soldiers, and I was going to be going over to Sub-Sahara. There was a filmmaker, Oliver Schmitz, who was coming to town, to Toronto, to Hot Docs with his book with his film about child soldiers. So I sent him a copy of, I said, I'd like to meet you to see who I should be meeting with when I go over to Sub-Sahara, if you could give me some leads. And he responded, and very graciously. So I gave him a copy of Chanda's Secrets to say thank you, and then the next year I was doing the book tour for Chanda's Secrets in the German edition, and he said I'd like to make a film of it when we met in Berlin. So it was wonderful. I got a chance to meet with him in advance to talk about what parts of the novel could be cut, what parts could be kept. I recommended Dennis Foon to do the screenplay, and he did a wonderful screenplay, great Canadian author from Vancouver. And then to be over there in Sub-Sahara and meeting the kids who were from locals and from Ellensdoorn. One of them had come from a very difficult background. She was 14, the one who played Chanda, and she ended up at an art school in Johannesburg as a result of the film. And the other actors from Johannesburg and Cape Town. It was just wonderful to see the piece come to life for the screen. I thought it was a wonderful adaptation, and I had a great experience with it.
That's wonderful. A final question, I'm going to open it up to anybody who has questions for our authors on the panel. And I wanted to ask, when I introduced you, Emil, I mentioned that you're an author of many, many hats, and it's a metaphor that you use to describe yourself because you work across so many mediums. And in some cases, I was reading and I was fascinated by this, that you say that sometimes your best work isn't with words, which is, I guess, against the grain of the title of our festival. But it's in a movement, it's in a ballet, it's in something that you've choreographed or something that happens on stage. How do you choose which medium you work with in order to tell a story?
It's like this notion of, I think the stories tell themselves, and we're drawn to them. It's almost as if, it's funny because Terry's spoken before about having, and I'm admitting to great envy here, the bullet points, the blueprint. And I do have a blueprint, but it often, if I built a bridge, it would be a disaster. There'd be cars tumbling off into the river on a regular basis. Because all this to say is, I don't know where a story's going to take me. And sometimes I think I do. I remember I did, just very quickly, I adapted Ian Brown's book. Ian's a fabulous writer for the Globe and Mail, The Boy in the Moon. And I was convinced with complete certainty that the last line of the play would be, I go where he goes. I can tell you that phrase doesn't even appear in the play now. So I follow the story, and I think once I'm drawn to a story, how can the story best be told? And it's a good point to me. People have a misconception that writing is about words. And there's a difference between let's say even a novel and narrative. Then others, you can tell a play, it's always about narrative as I see it, and not necessarily about a particular form of storytelling. And that you can have great moments of storytelling that are wordless. In Young Man with Camera, there are photographs that punctuate the story, which are essential to it. You can have even the absence of words within a story. I mean, even if you have a character who's inarticulate, that in of itself is part of the narrative. On stage plays, there are moments that I was describing Hannah's Suitcase, this true story of this young 13-year-old girl who was killed in Auschwitz, and there's a moment, and I told this to the students earlier today in St. Thomas, to me one of the most powerful moments was seeing this young girl who's told earlier, when it's your turn, And we understand that to be when you're standing at the platform in Auschwitz, don't forget to pinch your cheeks. And we understand why, because it's a desperate attempt to add some color, which of course is in vain. And there's a moment in the play where, sure enough, you have an actor playing a 13-year-old girl, puts her suitcase down and pinches her cheeks. So that to me is the power of storytelling. So as they say, it's not something I necessarily plan out. In the telling things service, and sometimes it's not necessarily finding the right word, it's finding the right moment. And to me, when I look back on novels that I've read and plays that I've seen and films that I've watched, and say, what are the moments that linger? I mean, just a quick aside, there's a movie, there's one called, I'm going to forget the name of the film. It's about two brothers set in Italy in the 1950s. Does anyone know? It's about two Italian brothers in the 1950s. And I'm completely blanking on the name, but the point being is they reconcile at the end. The last scene are two brothers making breakfast together. And I'll just, sorry? Big Night. Thank you. And I'll just end with just, again, just almost with a nod towards other writing, not my own. I saw a play, it must have been 40 years ago, I'm pretty sure. It was Elephant Man, based on a story, you know, the true story. And this man is utterly deformed, but for his left arm. And they made it was Jack Weatherall, Canadian actor on Broadway. And how did he portray himself without a stitch of makeup beyond stage makeup? So through his body, he implied the deformity that defined this man. And the actors responding to him, you know, often in horror and disgust, which they tried to mask. It was brilliant. And at the end of Act 1, he meets I'm going to call her the Angelina Jolie of her time. An actress we had a crush on. It's pathetic, because we know this man to be utterly deformed, but for his left hand. And there comes a time he meets her, and it's time to say goodbye. And she pauses, the actor playing the actress. And he, of course, extends the one piece of flesh that is untouched. And she stops, and she, of course, extends her hand and grabs his utterly deformed hand. And the audience was just reduced to a puddle. So these are the moments that stay with me, and I guess ultimately I strive, God willing, maybe before I die, to create those type of moments as well in the stories we tell.
Wonderful. Before we ask some questions with the audience, thank our guests on the panel. So does anybody have a question for any of our authors on the panel? Anybody who has anything?
You teased us about Andy's Facebook lists, and now I want to hear one.
Oh yeah, I've gathered myself since that question, and I found them on my iDoodle here. Yeah, I mean, these top 10 lists just kind of started off as a fun aside, and you know, I've been doing it long enough that I now have a whole stockpile of them that will hopefully turn into a book someday. But so there's a whole range of, some of them are more literal than others, some of them are kind of strange and surreal, some are kind of personal, but here's an example, and I won't read the numbers, but top 10 things that do not get better in time. Denial, grudge, sinking ship, open beer, burning building, childhood, dictatorship, tangled parachute, second law of thermodynamics, and heart failure.
Worth the wait, right? And just think, you open up your Facebook page and when Andy has a list, it's always a great moment. Any other questions for our panelists? So we have a hand, wait. Just wait for the mic, we can pick up your question.
Allan, when did you go to Oak Ridge? I went to Oak Ridge, 1964 through 68.
I wish you sound you're a really interesting person. I left Oak Ridge in 65.
Well, listen, let's get together and chat after the session.
Pleased to meet you.
Anyone else have any questions for our authors? Yeah, we got a hand right here. Yeah. You can project. Oh.
Very slow.
Joel's doing his best Phil Donahue through the audience.
I always want to know, when you were young and you discovered reading, who was the writer that made you decide that you wanted to become a writer? Each one of you.
Well, it's funny, you talk about sort of, one of the joys of parenthood, I have two daughters, they're now 19 and 21, but I was talking about somebody recently, the joys of parenthood is you revisit childhood, and you can reclaim it even momentarily. And I mentioned that in the context of, like, I don't know, well, no, I'm pretty sure this book affected me profoundly when I was 9, and when I was reading it to my children in my 40s, E.B. White's Charlotte's Web. And, you know, you talk about stories that endure. That writing is magnificent. The phrase, I think he talks about the patient breath of cows. I mean, it's just filled. It's gorgeous storytelling. You talk about dark. You know, we know what happens. You know, because I'm often asked in the context of Hanasukis, can children handle the story? Charlotte's Web is not an easy story, but it's magnificent. And as I say, it was just such a pleasure, because, again, the good stories endure, and in fact, they become richer over time. You can add that, maybe another list for Andy. And so here I am reading this book to my children, as I say, would have been 35 years later, and it has stood the test of time. So I would say E.B. White, and a pig. And now, I'm now vegetarian, but that's aside.
The one that I really liked as a kid was Q for Treason by Geoffrey Trees. It's wonderful. It's set in the time of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, and anyway, it's lots of fun. But I don't think there was ever a book that made me want to become a writer. I think that writing is just something that I do. It's like breathing, and it's always been like that from the time that I tried to form those words and make those connections and think through life. When kids I'm in schools and they're asking me, well, what should I do in order to get published? I said, well, never think about writing about being published. Think about writing because it's something you have to do, because you need to do it, because you'll suffocate if you don't do it. You do it because you just enjoy it, and then whatever happens, as in everything in life, happens. And it's just a practice. So that's what I would say about it. It's not really a choice.
My childhood, I think there would be two that spring to mind. One would be Robert Service. And really, it's not that I read Robert Service, it's that I listened to Robert Service. I went to a camp up in Lake Temagami, and at all the campfires, they would read Robert Service, and I can probably still recite, if you would like me to, you know, the shooting of Dan McGrew and Sam McGee. So, but the other one would be Arthur Conan Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes stories in particular, that really taught me to love the sentence. I loved the stories, they were wonderful, but when you've read the stories as many times as I have, you're almost reading it on a second level where you're just appreciating the use of language. And so those were two when I was a child. A little bit older, well, not a child, like a teenager maybe. Later on, Robertson Davies and John Irving, I would add to the list.
Hello. Yeah. I'm still not sure whether I want to be a poet. I mean, as a kid, I just kind of I drew and I made forts. And I suppose, like a lot of poets, I was a late bloomer as far as the writing of the poems goes, and it's not a particularly original answer, but I guess the big touchstone for me was Al Purdy. Even though I write poems that are very different than Al's now, I never met him, although I feel like he probably wouldn't like my poems very much. He was the one for me that made poetry possible, or seem as though it was possible.
Other questions, we can take them downstairs, and we're going to have more drinks. You've been sitting, you've been a wonderful, patient, engaged audience. We really appreciate it. Emil will be speaking on Sunday at the on Saturday. Thank you. Saturday. My goodness. Yes, exactly. On Saturday, Allan will be speaking on Saturday as well. Terry will be speaking tomorrow on Saturday, and it is Andy who is speaking on Sunday. Thank you all four of you for joining us, and join us downstairs for drinks to get your book signed and to meet the authors. Thank you.